have always remembered, I'm of the generation where the first touchstone for Cinderella was a Disney Cinderella. And then when I started becoming a fairy tale scholar, I remember finding all of the discourse about how she's so passive. And if you count the lines in the Disney animation, she says absolutely nothing. She has the least amount of words given. She's made voiceless in a lot of different ways. And then for my own doctoral work, I had to go back to that film. I did research on representation and kind of the space people are allowed to take up in variations of Disney fairy tales. So I, at one point, was comparing the 1950s animation to the 2010s version. I'm going to forget the exact year. I think 2017 Kenneth Branagh version. Um, where yes, the LS Cinderella figure speaks a lot more, but that version of the character is constantly saying, "Oh, just have courage and be kind. Take what's given. They'll maybe get something bad happen to them, maybe not. Like, but just you just have to live with it and keep going." And we don't see the forcefulness. If you watch that and you go back to the Disney animation, she doesn't say a lot, but what she says is important. She is, from the moment we meet her, telling the clock to stop telling me what to do. She is constantly passing commentary on the behavior of her stepfamily. She knows she doesn't deserve this. And at the end of the day, she's not going to the ball to find the prince. She's going to the ball because she wants a night out. And I think that's something that's actually quite relatable for anybody who's doing any level of work. You want a night off, you want a night out, you want to not be told what to do. And there's a lot of history in the 1950s that leads to that presentation of a character. But the passive Cinderella is not one that I personally recognize because then, you go from, as again, a reader of my generation, Disney becomes a gateway. If you're so inclined, you go into other fairy tales, you read the Grimm's versions, you find Ashputtel, you find, Or Coats of Many Furs or Rashin Cody. And everywhere you see women who are either recognizing that they're in danger and asking for help or trying to find a way out of it, having to be very clever, having to work within the confines of the world that they are given and get a way out, or otherwise vocalizing why they don't deserve what is being done to them. And that is where I also very much think that these, if we frame them differently, if we don't accept that these are stories that are just about the passivity of a character, if we look deeper, if we understand that fairy tales have been always a part of how we talk to each other about the things that we cannot say out loud, whether we're talking about, the French tradition under the Sun King, where you have female storytellers telling stories to argue for the rights of women, telling stories to talk about abuse, to talk about the lack of access to finances, to question the king, and in some times dying for telling those stories. If we understand that these are ways that people have communicated other kinds of information, we understand that story is freedom,
I love that.
then we can look at these differently.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I love that idea of fairy tales communicating things that we cannot say out loud.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of sort of Marina Warner's ideas. She wrote a great book, Beast to the From the Beast to the Blonde,
Yeah.
where she talks about the idea that these were stories passed down from women to women,
Mhm.
and they were gossip stories, stories told by the people carrying the female traditions. And I think, yeah, and picking up the idea of the salon writers and this sense of actually the concept fairy tale, which began with these salon writers, very
Yes.
much begins with this visualizing of these incredibly powerful female fairies who can come
Mhm.
and wave their wand and transform the unfair fate of their characters. So I think there's
Absolutely.
so much power of women and of girls seeded into these stories that it's incredibly important to
Absolutely.
to pick up again.
And I just want to pick up on what you just said, gossip stories. And because
Mm,
Bridgerton got raised in the commentary, those who watch, if you think back to season one, you have a main character who's about to be trapped in a marriage she doesn't want. And her mother's answer is, "We are going to talk." They are using the space that is left for women in a highly regimented society, that is left for women in a highly closed society. What can you do when you have no power? Well, you can talk, you can gossip,
Mm,
you can spread the rumor you need to spread
mm.
in order to change your fate.
Yes.
So this is where they stay relevant. This is a story that tells us we have a problem. I mean, we can look to our news cycles. We have a problem that we cannot talk about head on. So the answer is actually to talk about it.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely. I love that. And I think I love that sense of, fairy tales as rebellious, right? Fairy
Hmm.
tales as holding, seeding, ways of communicating with each other when other ways might be unsafe. And I think Seema Anand, who's an incredible storyteller, is also joining us on this course, also talks about the idea that fairy tales hold the secrets that have been unsaid or have been said different ways. And I think that's incredibly important. And that sense of fairy tales as holding different value systems as well, and value systems that might not, for example, have been in different cultures acceptable. This idea of wonder, right, that we haven't really touched on, but this idea of wonder and animism, the idea of living in a world that's alive, living in a world that's responsive.
Hmm.
um, and Christina Bakalego, who's also
Yeah.
an incredible professor who's joining us on the course, has talked recently about how we can see fairy tales as one example of wonder works which exist the world over. And wonder works invite us to relate to a world that's living, that's alive. And
Hmm.
I think that, this idea of a world that's magical in a way, or that's very much animate, living, again, would have been unsafe in different times, in different places. But actually, fairy tales, stories that seem to be just told to children or in the nursery, still contain these seeds of transformative practice, I think.
I fully agree. And I'm wondering if you can speak to a bit how that idea might drive you as a storyteller who specifically works with fairy tales, who specifically, I think my understanding of your work and what I've been able to experience of your storytelling is going back to the root, but not to preserve something, but rather to see what might grow. And could you speak about that a little bit?
Thank you. That's a beautiful way of seeing it. I think, I yeah, I really I became obsessed with fairy tales because I think that in a world that's so globalized, fairy tales are things that we share, and also they're things that we think that we know when actually we often don't know their complexity, but they do feel very much like a common ground, like a space where we can enter imaginative conversation together. And I think today, when the world is so fluxing and fluid, and we're trying so hard to speak to each other, and so often we miss communication. The world is very polarized. It's very hard to talk, and it's very hard to dream together today. And I think fairy tales are spaces in which we can dream together. They're often spaces that people feel safe in, even though they dramatize, as you said at the beginning, incredible danger and abuse. They're also often stories that are framed with a happy ending. So we know that we're going to get out in the end, and we know that community will hold us through that and to do that. And so I think that for me, that juxtaposition of stories that feel familiar and safe and
Mhm.
known, and at the same time are deeply unknown because we've forgotten their diversity, we've forgotten their complexity, we've forgotten their wild ecologies, is very much what drives me to work with the fairy tales in I think both as a scholar but also as a storyteller. When I was working on my PhD, became really obsessed with this socio-narratologist called Arthur Frank, and he talks about letting stories breathe. And so that's, I think, at the heart of my work. How do we let stories breathe? And I think a lot of what I do in storytelling is inviting that into both speaking the story collectively and also talking about it. And that's a good segue into, I think, the course that we're going to be running,
Yeah.
because very much that's what we're going to do during the course. It's that collective conversation with teachers, but also with the participants, inviting us to just remember the complexity of story and fairy tale, and the way it takes us between the human and the more than human. And Michelle will be joining us on the course. I'm really excited excited about that. We're going to talk about East of the Moon, West of the Sun,
Yeah.
which, if you know it, if the rest of you know it, it's an incredible story about a girl who marries a bear. We have some other fantastic teachers on the course. So I think we're almost ready to open for questions. I think
So,
there are a few coming in the chat, but maybe just one final point, Michelle, before we open for questions. I just wondered, as a fairy tale scholar, so you asked me about my practice as a storyteller.
yeah.
But as a fairy tale scholar, what do you think is the most important thing that we need to do with fairy tales today? How should we be working with fairy tales in this really complex world that we find ourselves today?
Think we should read them. It's a very simple answer, but I th every time I open up, a database, I have some pop-up going, here, can I give you an AI summary of this thing? Resist, please. Because I think what we need to do is remember that story makes us human. Story is one of the most human things that we have. It's part of a common inheritance. Every culture tells story. And whether we call it a fairy tale or a wonder tale, whether we use it as a jumping off point for new stories, whether we use it as a jumping off point to find older stories, fairy tale is such a beautiful invitation into thinking that the world might be different. And whether I'm studying, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm just kind of experiencing media on my own, I think that is kind of the core root of my research. Very much indebted to some of the scholars that we've mentioned today, but also I think a couple of the writers and editors we have in the room. So Christina Bachialega's work was foundational for me as a scholar, but Terry Winling's work was foundational for me as a reader because she and Ellen Datlow are two of the names of people who cracked open the fairy tales in a new way at the time that I was a child reader. And that seed of imagination, that I think is something that we can't let go of, and we have to refuse to seed in a world that's telling us to stop trying, to stop thinking, to stop dreaming, to stop imagining. So for me, that's really, really what the purpose of fairy tale can be reawakened to be for us now in this moment.